Houston, 1996. A 15-year-old girl vanished while walking home from school. Within hours, she was chained in a stranger's room, her life hanging by a thread. But her captor, so confident in his control, made a fatal mistake. He failed to realize his greatest weapon was not the chains but her own brilliant mind. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The humid, late afternoon air of a Houston September was a familiar blanket, a signal that the school day was over and the quiet comfort of home was just a short walk away. For 15-year-old Danielle Carter, this walk was a ritual, a time to decompress and let the structured chaos of high school recede. Her mind, however, was rarely still. As she walked, her gaze would sweep over her surroundings, not with the idle glance of a typical teenager, but with the focused, analytical lens of a born observer. She noticed things. A new crack in the sidewalk, the specific model of a car parked on the street, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of a live oak tree. Her brain was a high-fidelity recording device, constantly taking in, processing, and filing away information. This unique quality of her mind was on full display earlier that day at the Northwood High Debate Club meeting. The topic was municipal resource allocation, a subject that made most of her peers' eyes glaze over. But Danielle was in her element. She stood at the podium, not with fiery, dramatic rhetoric, but with a calm, surgical precision. She dismantled her opponent's argument piece by piece, citing specific budget lines, quoting a city council meeting transcript from 3 months prior, and even referencing a small detail from a footnote in a public works report. She didn't just argue. She presented an irrefutable case built from a mosaic of facts she had meticulously gathered and stored. Her teachers called it a gift. Her friends called it the Danielle database. To her, it was just how her mind worked. This intellectual sharpness was nurtured at home. Her mother, Sharon Carter, was a registered nurse, a woman whose life was a study in pragmatism, empathy, and quiet strength. As a single parent, she had raised Danielle not to be just a good girl, but a smart one. Their small, tidy home was filled with books, and the dinner table was a place for lively discussions about current events, ethics, and the world at large. Sharon had taught her daughter the importance of self-reliance and the power of a well-informed mind. "The world isn't always fair, Danny," she would often say. "But it almost always yields to a person who has done their homework." Their relationship was built on a foundation of deep, mutual respect. They were more than mother and daughter, they were a team. Sharon trusted Danielle's judgment, and Danielle, in turn, never took that trust for granted. The walk home from school was a straight, familiar path through a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a route they had agreed upon for its safety. It was a journey Danielle had made 1,000 times without incident, her biggest concern usually being whether she'd have time to finish her homework before dinner. The world, for all its potential dangers that her mother warned of, felt predictable, manageable, a system whose rules could be learned and navigated. She believed, with the quiet confidence of a 15-year-old who had always excelled, that her mind was capable of solving any problem that came her way. She had no way of knowing that on this perfectly ordinary Tuesday, she was about to face a problem that had no textbook, no rule book, and no easy answer. The walk home was a straight shot down a series of quiet, tree-lined residential streets. Danielle's house was just under a mile from the school, a distance she could cover in about 15 minutes at a brisk pace. On this day, her mind was occupied with the lingering thrill of her debate club victory and a mental outline of an upcoming chemistry paper. She was so engrossed in her thoughts that she barely registered the dark blue sedan that passed her, slowed, and then pulled over to the curb about 50 feet ahead. It was an unremarkable car, a common domestic model, clean but not flashy. A man was in the driver's seat, and as Danielle approached, he leaned over and rolled down the passenger side window. He looked to be in his 40s, with a neat, trimmed haircut and a plain, collared shirt. He had the bland, forgettable face of a suburban dad, a face that projected an aura of absolute normalcy. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice polite and even. He was holding a small, white dog on his lap, a fluffy creature that was yapping with a high-pitched, excited energy. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think my little guy here just slipped his collar. I saw him run up into one of these yards. His name is Buttons. You haven't seen a small white dog, have you?" Danielle paused. Her mother's warnings about strangers were a foundational rule of her life, a piece of core programming. But this scenario didn't fit the typical danger profile. The man wasn't trying to lure her into his car. He seemed genuinely distressed, and the presence of the small, yapping dog was a powerful disarming agent. Predators, in her mind, were shadowy figures in dark alleys, not polite, middle-aged men worried about their lost pet. "No, sir, I haven't," she said, keeping a safe distance on the sidewalk. "But I can keep an eye out as I walk. Thank you so much," he said, his face a mask of worried relief. "He's just a little rascal. He couldn't have gone far." He made a show of looking up and down the street, a performance of frantic concern. "You know," he said, a sudden idea seeming to strike him. "His name tag has my number on it. If you do see him, could you do me a huge favor and just hold on to him and give me a call? I can't lose him. He belonged to my daughter." The mention of a daughter was a subtle, brilliant touch. It instantly reframed him, painting him as a grieving father, a sympathetic figure. It was a detail designed to lower her guard, and it worked. "Of course," Danielle said, her natural empathy kicking in. "Could you just come a little closer so I can give you my card?" he asked, fumbling in his pocket. "My cell number is on it. I'd really appreciate it." This was the critical moment, the closing of the distance. She hesitated for only a second. He wasn't asking her to get in the car. He was just asking her to take a business card. It seemed like a small, harmless request. She took 2 steps off the sidewalk and approached the passenger window. The moment she was within arm's reach, the facade of the concerned pet owner vanished. In a single, shockingly fast and fluid motion, his left hand shot out of the window and clamped around her arm like a steel trap. The small dog was gone, likely a prop he had dropped to the floor. Before she could even process the change, before she could scream, his other hand was on the back of her head, and he was pulling her with an incredible, terrifying force, half dragging her through the open window and into the car. The entire event took less than 5 seconds. It was a masterpiece of violent efficiency, executed in broad daylight on a quiet suburban street. One moment, Danielle Carter was a high school student thinking about chemistry. The next, she was on the floor of a stranger's car, the door slamming shut, the engine roaring as it sped away. The ordinary day had fractured, plunging her into a nightmare that was as sudden as it was absolute. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was a sound Sharon Carter usually found comforting, a steady heartbeat in her quiet, well-ordered home. But as the clock struck 4, then 4:15, the familiar sound began to take on a menacing quality. Each tick was a reminder of time passing, of a routine that had been broken. Danielle was late. At first, Sharon pushed the worry away with rationalizations. A late bus, a last-minute study session with friends, a teacher who held the class over. Danielle was a responsible girl, but even the most responsible teenager could lose track of time. Sharon busied herself in the kitchen, prepping vegetables for dinner, her movements a familiar, calming ritual. But her eyes kept flicking to the clock on the wall, her ears straining for the sound of a key in the front door. By 4:30, the quiet hum of anxiety had grown into a loud, insistent alarm. Danielle was never this late without calling. Never. It was one of their cardinal rules, a cornerstone of the trust between them. Sharon wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone, her own hand trembling slightly. She called Danielle's best friend, Maria. "Have you seen Danny?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light and casual. "Not since school let out, Mrs. Carter," Maria replied. She said she was heading straight home. "Is everything okay?" "I'm sure at Island, thanks, sweetie," Sharon said, hanging up before her voice could betray the fear that was now coiling in her stomach. She called another friend, then another. The answer was always the same. No one had seen her since the final bell. The panic began to set in, a cold, creeping dread that started in her chest and spread through her limbs. She walked to the front door and looked out at the street, as if she could will her daughter to appear. The street was empty, bathed in the long golden shadows of the late afternoon. It looked exactly as it did every other day, but now it seemed alien, menacing, a place where something terrible had happened in plain sight. Her mind, the logical, methodical mind of a nurse trained to assess and react, began to spiral into a maelstrom of worst-case scenarios. An accident, a sudden illness, or something else, something worse. The kind of nameless, faceless danger that every parent fears in the deepest, darkest corners of their heart. At 5 o'clock, an hour and a half after Danielle should have been home, Sharon Carter did the thing she had never imagined she would have to do. She dialed 911. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was a mixture of the nurse's practiced calm and the mother's raw, ragged terror. "My daughter is missing," she said, the words feeling foreign and horrifying on her tongue. "She's 15 years old. She never came home from school." The response was swift. A patrol car arrived, and 2 officers took her statement. They were professional and kind, but Sharon could feel the undercurrent of procedural skepticism. A 15-year-old girl, an hour or 2 late coming home. In 99% of these cases, there was a simple, teenage explanation, but Sharon knew her daughter. She described Danielle's unwavering reliability, her focus, their open communication. She was not a parent in denial. She was a witness to her daughter's character. "This is not her," she insisted, her voice shaking with a conviction that was absolute. "Something is wrong. I know it." The officers filed a report, and soon after, a call came from the Houston Police Department's Special Victims Division. A detective would be assigned to the case. His name was Marcus Jones. The name meant nothing to her then. It was just another piece of information in a terrifying new reality that was unfolding with a nightmarish speed. The invisible clock had started ticking the moment Danielle failed to walk through the door, and for Sharon, every passing second was an eternity of helpless, suffocating fear. For Detective Marcus Jones, the call came in just as he was finishing up a mountain of paperwork from another case, a missing 15-year-old girl. It was a dispatch call that always sent a jolt of urgency through him, cutting through the weary cynicism that came with 2 decades of working in the Special Victims Division. He had seen too many of these cases play out, and he knew, with a certainty born of bitter experience, that the first few hours were the most critical. They were the golden hours, the window of opportunity when the trail was warmest and the chances of a positive outcome were at their highest. After that, the odds began to drop with a terrifying, exponential speed. He drove to the Carter home himself, his unmarked sedan cutting through the early evening traffic. He was a man in his late 40s, with a quiet, imposing presence and kind, weary eyes that had seen far too much. He was a father to 2 daughters, one of whom was not much older than Danielle. This professional duty was always deeply personal. He found Sharon Carter in her living room, a woman who was clearly trying to hold herself together, but whose frayed nerves were visible in her clenched hands and the tremor in her voice. He had seen this look 1,000 times, the look of a parent whose world had been ripped from its axis. His first job was not to investigate, but to build a bridge of trust. He spoke in a low, calm voice, his questions gentle but precise. He didn't treat her like a hysterical mother. He treated her like the single most important witness in his investigation. He listened, truly listened, as she painted a portrait of her daughter. He heard about the debate club, the perfect grades, the unwavering reliability. The picture that emerged was not of a troubled teen likely to run away, but of a focused, stable, and deeply loved young woman. "She's a thinker, Detective," Sharon said, her voice filled with a desperate, fierce pride. "She's smart. If anyone can handle themselves, it's Danielle." Detective Jones believed her. He had learned over the years to trust a parent's instinct, especially a parent as clear-headed as Sharon Carter. This wasn't a runaway case. This was an abduction. He put the official wheels in motion. He issued a bolo, "Be on the lookout for Danielle," her description broadcast to every patrol car in the city. He dispatched officers to the school to re-interview her friends and teachers, to canvass the route she walked home, to search for any scrap of evidence, any witness who might have seen something out of the ordinary. But the early reports that came back were disheartening. No one had seen anything. The route was a quiet residential area with few pedestrians and no businesses with security cameras. It was as if Danielle had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation was a frantic search for a starting point, for a single thread to pull on in a seamless fabric of mystery. They had a victim, they had a timeline, but they had no crime scene, no suspect, and no motive. They were fighting an invisible enemy, a predator who had struck with a chilling precision and had left no trace. As the sun set and darkness fell over Houston, the sense of urgency in the small command post they had set up at the precinct intensified. Detective Jones knew that the invisible clock was ticking louder with every passing minute. He was a man accustomed to the grim realities of his job, but the thought of what this young, intelligent girl might be enduring was a heavy weight on his conscience. He looked at the school picture of Danielle that Sharon had given him, a bright, confident girl with a spark of intelligence in her eyes. He made a silent promise to her and to her mother. He would not stop. He would not rest. He was racing against a clock he couldn't see, in a search for a girl who had been swallowed by the city, hoping, praying, that they were not already too late. The return to consciousness was a slow, syrupy process. Danielle's first sensation was a dull, throbbing ache at the back of her head, followed by the rough, scratchy texture of a carpet against her cheek. A strange, antiseptic smell, like a cleaning product, filled her nostrils. For a moment, she was suspended in a state of pure, disoriented confusion. Where was she? What had happened? Then, the memory of the past few minutes, or had it been longer, came rushing back with a horrifying clarity. The man. The car. The sudden, brutal act of violence. The memory was a jolt of pure, ice-cold terror that shot through her body, snapping her into a state of full, hyper-alertness. She didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. Her debater's mind, trained to assess and analyze under pressure, took over. To react with panic, to scream or struggle, would be to give her captor information about her state of mind. Her first priority was to gather information about her own. She lay perfectly still, her breathing shallow and even, feigning continued unconsciousness. She took a quick mental inventory of her own body. Her head hurt, but she didn't think she was seriously injured. Her arms and legs responded to her mental commands. Then she felt it, a heavy, cold weight around her left ankle. She mentally traced its shape. It was a metal cuff of some kind, connected to a chain that was pulled taut. She was restrained. Her mind, despite the terror that was thrumming just beneath the surface, began to work with a strange, chilling calm. This was a problem. A complex, terrifying problem. And the only way to solve a problem was to first define its parameters. She needed data. She slowly, almost imperceptibly, opened her eyes. Just a slit, enough to take in her immediate surroundings without moving her head. She was in a bedroom. The carpet was a nondescript beige. The walls were a pale, sterile blue. The room was bathed in the soft, dim light of a single lamp on a nightstand. She listened. She could hear the low hum of an air conditioner. Faintly, from what sounded like another room, she could hear the muffled sound of a television. And then she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the bedroom door. She snapped her eyes shut, her body going limp, her breathing returning to the slow, even rhythm of sleep. The door opened with a soft click. She could feel a presence in the room, standing over her. The silence stretched for an unbearable eternity. "I know you're awake," a man's voice said. It was the same calm, even voice from the car. Danielle didn't react. She remained perfectly still, her mind racing. Was this a test? A bluff? She felt a hand on her shoulder and was shaken, not violently, but with a firm, insistent pressure. "There's no point in pretending," the voice said. "Sit up, we need to talk." Slowly, deliberately, Danielle opened her eyes and pushed herself into a sitting position, her movements careful, projecting weakness and fear. She finally got a clear look at her captor. It was the man from the car, the man who had called himself Leonard Price. He was standing a few feet away, his expression not menacing or angry, but calm, almost detached, like a scientist observing a specimen. She also got her first clear look at the room. It was a perfectly ordinary, depressingly neat bedroom. There was a made bed, a dresser, a nightstand, and her chain was bolted to the heavy cast-iron frame of the bed. Her assessment of the situation was instantaneous and terrifying. She was in a private residence, in a locked room, chained to a piece of immovable furniture, and at the complete mercy of the man standing before her. The terror was a physical thing, a cold, heavy weight in her stomach. But alongside the terror, another part of her mind was already at work, the part that had won debate trophies and aced logic exams. It was the part of her that was already searching for a flaw in the system, a crack in the prison wall. Her body was a captive, but her mind was not. And in that silent, terrifying moment, she made a conscious decision. She would let him see her fear. She would let him believe he had broken her. But behind the mask of the terrified victim, her mind would be working, observing, analyzing, and searching for a way out. The man, her captor, pulled a straight-backed chair from a corner of the room and sat down a few feet in front of her. He did not seem like a monster from a horror movie. He was not wild-eyed or menacing. He was calm, articulate, and carried himself with an air of chilling, intellectual superiority. This, Danielle realized, was far more terrifying. This was not an act of random, chaotic violence. This was a plan. "My name is Robert Evans," he said, his voice as even and unremarkable as his appearance. He had lied about his name in the car, another layer of his methodical deception. "You are going to be staying with me for a while. There are some rules you will need to learn if you want this to be a pleasant experience for both of us." His tone was that of a manager explaining company policy to a new employee. It was this detached, almost bureaucratic approach to the horror he was inflicting that was so profoundly unsettling. He saw this not as a crime, but as a project, a situation he was managing. "Rule number 1, he continued, holding up a finger. "You do not scream. You do not make any loud noises. The walls are thick, but there is no need to test them. Rule number 2, you will do exactly as I say, when I say it. Compliance is the key to your comfort. Rule number 3, do not try to fight or resist. As you can see," he gestured to the chain on her ankle, "I have taken precautions. Any resistance would be futile, and for you, unpleasant." Danielle just nodded, her eyes wide, her expression a carefully constructed mask of pure terror. She made a conscious choice to play the role he expected, the helpless, broken victim. Every nod, every whimper, every averted gaze was a strategic move, designed to feed his ego, to reinforce his sense of absolute control. The more he believed he had won, the more careless he might become. His arrogance was a palpable thing. It was clear in the condescending way he spoke to her, in the smug satisfaction on his face. He believed he had thought of everything. He had chosen his victim carefully, executed the abduction flawlessly, and had created a secure, controlled environment. He saw her not as a person, not as a 15-year-old girl with a mind of her own, but as an object, a possession, a problem that he had successfully solved. It was this monumental arrogance that made him blind. He was so focused on the physical restraints, the locked door, the heavy chain, that he completely overlooked the true nature of his captive. He could not see the sharp, analytical mind that was working furiously behind her terrified eyes. He did not realize that while he was explaining his rules, she was already studying him, analyzing his speech patterns, his body language, his psychological profile, and she was studying the room. Her prison was also his personal space, a room filled with the mundane artifacts of his life. He was so confident in her powerlessness that he had made no effort to sanitize the environment. To him, the objects in the room were just background noise. To Danielle, they were clues. They were data points. They were the potential keys to her survival. His arrogance was not just a character flaw, it was a tactical weakness. And as he droned on about his rules, Danielle Carter, the star debater, the keen observer, was already preparing her counter-argument, an argument she would make not with words, but with action. While one part of Danielle's mind was occupied with projecting an image of pure, submissive terror, the other part was working with the cool, methodical precision of a crime scene investigator. She knew that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Fear was a fog that clouded judgment, and she needed her judgment to be crystal clear. So, she compartmentalized. The terror was real, a cold, humming current beneath the surface, but she refused to let it take control. Instead, she channeled all of her mental energy into a single, critical task: observation and memorization. Her gaze, which she kept lowered in a show of fear, was actually in constant, sweeping motion. She began to build a mental inventory of the room, a detailed, multi-sensory database of her prison. It was a technique she had honed for debate club, the ability to absorb and retain vast amounts of information under pressure. Now, her life depended on it. She started with the large objects. A queen-sized bed with a dark cherry wood headboard. The chain on her ankle was bolted directly to its heavy frame. A matching dresser stood against the far wall. On top of it, there was a small collection of items. She focused on them, her mind a camera, zooming in, recording the details. There was a framed photograph. It showed her captor, Robert Evans, standing with an older woman, likely his mother. They were standing in front of a small brick house with distinctive white shutters. In the corner of the photo, a street sign was partially visible. She couldn't make out the full name, but she could see the last 4 letters. View. Fairview? Bayview? It was a partial clue, but a clue nonetheless. Next to the photo was a small ceramic tray holding a man's watch, some loose change, and a set of keys. She noted the brand of the watch, Timex. She counted the keys, 4 of them on a simple silver ring. One looked like a car key, with the small logo of a Ford. Her eyes moved to the nightstand next to the bed. It was cluttered with the detritus of a daily life. There was a lamp, a digital alarm clock displaying the time in red numerals, a half-empty glass of water, and 2 prescription medication bottles. This was a potential goldmine of information. While he was distracted, talking about the food schedule he had planned for her, she risked a direct, 2-second glance. Her mind snapped a perfect, high-resolution photograph. The name on the prescription label was clear. Robert Evans. The name of the medication was Zoloft. The prescribing doctor's name was Dr. A. Friedman. The pharmacy was a CVS, and she could see the address printed on the label, a street name and a zip code. It was a torrent of concrete, verifiable data. Her senses were on high alert. The antiseptic smell she had first noticed, she identified it now as pine sol. The beige carpet was low pile, industrial grade. The air conditioner in the window was a Kenwood model, and it rattled with a specific, rhythmic pattern. These were all small, seemingly insignificant details. But in her situation, there was no such thing as an insignificant detail. Each one was a potential piece of the puzzle. She saw a pile of mail on a small desk in the corner. She couldn't read the addresses from her position on the floor, but she could see the return addresses on the top 2 envelopes. One was from a credit card company, the other from a local utility provider. More confirmation of his identity, his connection to this specific place. She catalogued his appearance. Approximately 6 feet tall, maybe 190 pounds. Brown hair, with flecks of gray at the temples, a small circular scar above his right eyebrow. He was wearing a simple, gold wedding band, but the photograph on the dresser only showed him with his mother. Was he married, divorced, a widower? Every detail, no matter how small, was added to the mental file. He mistook her quiet, focused stillness for a state of catatonic fear. He saw a girl who had been broken, who had surrendered to his control. He had no idea that beneath that silent, terrified exterior, a database was being built, a case file was being assembled. Danielle Carter was not just a captive, she was a witness, and she was meticulously gathering the evidence that she was determined to one day use to put him away forever. After what felt like an eternity of laying out his rules and establishing his dominance, Robert Evans stood up. The chillingly calm, managerial part of his monologue was over. "I have to go out for a little while," he said, his voice casual, as if he were speaking to a roommate, not a captive. "There is a meeting I cannot miss. It will not take long, an hour, maybe 2 at the most." This was the moment, the first, and perhaps only, flaw in his otherwise meticulous plan. His need to maintain the facade of his normal life, to attend a meeting, to keep up appearances, was creating an opportunity. He was going to leave her alone. "I trust I don't need to remind you of the rules," he said, looking down at her, a smug, confident smile on his face. "The chain is solid steel. The door will be locked from the outside. There is no way out. Any attempt to make noise will be unwise." He clearly believed his physical restraints were infallible. His arrogance had made him blind to any other possibility. He saw the chain, the lock, the terrified girl on the floor, and in his mind, the equation was solved. He had absolute control. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back at her one last time. "Be a good girl, and I'll bring you back something to eat," he said. The words a grotesque parody of paternal care. Then he stepped out, and she heard the sharp, definitive click of the deadbolt sliding into place. His footsteps receded down a hallway. She heard a front door open and close. A few moments later, the sound of a car engine starting, and then the sound faded into the distance. She was alone. The silence that filled the room was a different kind of silence than the one she had endured during his monologue. This was the silence of opportunity. The silence of a ticking clock. She didn't move for a full minute, her ears straining, listening for any sound that might indicate it was a trick, that he was still in the house. But there was nothing, only the low, rhythmic rattle of the air conditioner. The terror she had been suppressing was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But now, it was mixed with a new, powerful emotion. A surge of adrenaline, a focused, electric sense of purpose. Her mind, which had been in a defensive, data-gathering mode, now switched to offense. It was time to solve the problem. She sat up and began a calm, methodical assessment of her restraints. She pulled at the chain. It was, as he had boasted, solid steel, the cuff around her ankle tight and unyielding. She followed the chain to where it was bolted to the bed frame. The bolts were thick, industrial grade, sunk deep into the heavy iron. There was no breaking it, no slipping out of it. The chain was a fixed variable in the equation. Her attention turned to the door. She crawled the length of the chain, as far as it would allow, until she was just a few feet from the bedroom door. She examined the knob, the frame. It was a standard, solid wood interior door. But it was the deadbolt that made it a fortress. There was no way to bypass it from the inside without tools she did not have. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over her. He was right. He had thought of everything. The physical prison was perfect, but her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from a long-ago conversation about problem-solving. If you can't go through it, you go around it. If you can't go around it, you go over or under it. There's always another way, Danny. You just have to find it. She crawled back to the center of the room and forced her mind to be calm, to be logical. He had focused his security on the obvious points of egress, her own body and the door, the chain and the lock. But what had he missed? What had he, in his monumental arrogance, deemed insignificant? Her eyes swept the room again, not as a passive observer, but as an active strategist, searching for a weakness. The bed, the dresser, the desk, the walls, and then she saw it. The window. It was a standard, double-hung window, the kind found in thousands of suburban homes. It was not barred, it was not boarded up. It was just a window. And on it, she could see the small, simple, crescent-shaped latch that held the two panes together. It was a flimsy, cheap piece of hardware, designed to keep out the rain, not to keep in a prisoner. It was the overlooked flaw in his perfect system. The adrenaline surged, sharp and potent. The clock was ticking. She had no idea if she had 2 hours or 20 minutes, but she had found another way. And now, she had to act. Back at the precinct, Detective Jones was staring at a large map of Houston spread out across a table, a grim, silent witness to 1,000 other desperate searches. The area where Danielle had last been seen was circled in red. It was an agonizingly large circle, encompassing hundreds of residential streets, a maze of anonymous, suburban houses. He was working on the grim, statistical probability that she was still somewhere within that circle. Predators who targeted victims of opportunity often stayed close to their comfort zones, to their own neighborhoods. But without a witness, without a license plate, without a single piece of concrete evidence, his search was a blind one. He was on the phone with Sharon Carter, giving her an update that was not an update. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. "We have patrols saturating the area. We're talking to everyone. These one many Formentons." "She's strong, Detective," Sharon said from the other end of the line, her voice trembling but firm. It was a statement she had repeated several times, a mantra of desperate maternal faith. Danielle is not a girl who panics. She's a thinker. She's a fighter. Wherever she is, I know she is fighting. You have to believe me. Detective Jones did believe her. In his long, weary career, he had learned that there were different kinds of strength. There was the strength of muscle and bone, the strength of a scream, of a physical struggle. But there was another, quieter, and often more powerful kind of strength. The strength of a sharp, disciplined mind. He had seen it before, in survivors who had managed to outwit their attackers, who had used their intellect as a weapon. He looked again at the school picture of Danielle, at her clear, intelligent eyes. There was a quiet confidence in her gaze, an almost unnerving level of self-possession for a 15-year-old. Sharon wasn't just a mother clinging to hope. She was giving him a key piece of the puzzle, a vital insight into the victim's character. "I believe you, Mrs. Carter," he said, and he meant it. 100%. This brief conversation, a moment of shared, desperate faith between a mother and a detective, was a small but crucial pivot in the narrative. It reinforced for Detective Jones that he was not just looking for a terrified, helpless child. He was looking for a young woman who was, in all likelihood, actively working to save herself. It was a thought that both inspired him and terrified him. He knew that the kind of predator who planned an abduction this carefully would be calculating and ruthless. A battle of wits between a teenage girl and a seasoned criminal was a high-stakes game with the most terrible of consequences. He hung up the phone and turned back to the map, his gaze hardening with a renewed sense of resolve. He was not just waiting for a lead to fall into his lap. He was trying to think like his victim. If he were her, smart, observant, what would he be doing? He would be looking for an opening, for a mistake. The thought sent a chill down his spine. The captor's first mistake would be Danielle's first opportunity, and in that moment, the entire investigation would shift. It would become a race between her ability to escape and her captor's realization that the girl he had taken was not the easy victim he had assumed her to be. The thought of Danielle's strength was a beacon of hope, but it was also a reminder of the incredible danger she was in. The room was a cage of calculated design, but every cage has a weak point. Danielle's mind, now fully engaged in problem-solving mode, focused on the window with an intense, singular clarity. It was her only variable, her only hope. The chain was her first obstacle. It allowed her to reach the door, but the window was on the opposite wall. She stretched the chain as far as it would go. Her fingertips could just barely brush against the windowsill. It wasn't enough. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning for any object she could use as a tool. A lamp, a book. But there was nothing that could give her the extra reach she needed. The room was Spartan, the furniture heavy and immovable. She refused to let the frustration take hold. There had to be a way. She returned to the bed, the anchor point of her captivity, and re-examined the connection. The chain was bolted to the iron frame. She couldn't move the bed, but could she move the mattress? It was heavy, a thick, queen-sized mattress, but it was not fixed in place. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she began to push and shove, her muscles screaming in protest. It was a slow, agonizing process. She managed to slide it a few inches, then a few more. She worked for what felt like an eternity, her breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat stinging her eyes. Finally, she had moved it just enough. By sliding the mattress to the far edge of the bed frame, she had gained an extra 2 feet of slack in the chain. It was just enough. She scrambled to the window, the chain now blessedly loose around her ankle. She reached up and examined the latch. It was a simple, cheap, crescent-shaped piece of metal, held in place by 2 small screws. It was flimsy, but it was locked tight. Her first attempt was with her fingernails, trying to pry it open. The metal wouldn't budge. She needed a tool, something thin and hard. Her eyes darted around the room again. Her gaze fell on the small desk in the corner. On it was a simple, wire-bound notebook. Hope surged through her. A paperclip, or even the wire binding itself. She crawled to the desk. The notebook was just within her reach. With trembling fingers, she tore at the spiral binding, trying to unthread a piece of the wire. It was tougher than it looked. The wire cut into her fingers, but she ignored the pain. Finally, a 6-inch piece of the stiff wire came free. It wasn't much, but it was a tool. It was a weapon. She returned to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She carefully inserted the end of the wire into the small gap between the two sashes of the window, right next to the latch. She began to probe, to scrape, trying to get enough leverage to force the crescent lock to turn. It was a delicate, frustrating process. The wire bent. She straightened it and tried again. She could hear the ticking of the alarm clock on the nightstand, each second a loud, mocking reminder of her limited time. Any minute now, she could hear the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, but she forced it down, channeling the fear into a focused, desperate energy. After several agonizing minutes of scraping and prying, she felt a small, almost imperceptible give. The latch had moved a fraction of an inch. Renewed hope surged through her. She worked the wire back and forth with a new frenzy. And then, with a soft, metallic click, the latch turned. The window was unlocked. The moment of triumph was fleeting, immediately replaced by the next, equally difficult challenge. She pushed at the lower sash of the window. It was stuck, sealed shut by years of paint and humidity. She threw her shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. She looked at the alarm clock. Nearly an hour had passed since he had left. She was running out of time. She scanned the room one last time, her eyes landing on the one object she had overlooked. On the floor, by the leg of the desk, was a single, stray shoe. It must have been his. It was a heavy, leather dress shoe. It was a tool. It was a hammer. She grabbed the shoe and, using the hard heel, began to strike the window frame, not the glass. She hit it once, twice, 3 times. The sound a loud, terrifying thud in the quiet room. She was taking a huge risk. The noise could alert a neighbor, but it was a risk she had to take. On the 5th strike, she heard a crack. The paint seal had broken. She dropped the shoe and pushed with all her might. The window slid open with a loud, groaning squeal. A wave of fresh, humid Houston air, filled with the scent of cut grass and freedom, washed over her. The overlooked flaw had become her escape route. The clock was ticking. The window was open, a dark, rectangular portal to a world she had thought she might never see again. But her escape was not yet complete. The chain was still a tether, a final, cruel link to her prison. She looked out the window. It was on the ground floor, but it was at the back of the house, overlooking a small, fenced-in backyard. The drop was only a few feet. Getting out was the easy part, but the chain would limit her movement, would make a silent escape impossible. She looked back at the bed. The chain was bolted to the frame, but the frame itself was just iron. Could she break the frame? No, it was too solid. Could she unbolt it? Impossible without a wrench. Her mind raced, cycling through a dozen impossible scenarios. Then her eyes fell on the mattress she had moved. It was sitting half on, half off the box spring. And beneath it, she saw the wooden slats that supported the mattress. They were just simple pine boards, held in place by a few screws. A new, audacious plan formed in her mind. She couldn't break the chain. She couldn't break the bed frame, but maybe, just maybe, she could take a piece of the bed with her. She went back to the desk and retrieved her makeshift tool, the piece of wire from the notebook. It was not a screwdriver, but it was the only thing she had. She crawled back to the bed and began to work on the screws, holding the nearest wooden slat in place. It was a slow, maddening process. The screws were old and tight. The wire was a clumsy, inefficient tool. Her fingers were raw and bleeding, but she worked with a focused, desperate intensity. One screw came loose, then a second. The third was stubborn, but with a final, agonizing twist it gave way. The wooden slat, a heavy piece of pine about 3 feet long, came free from the bed frame, and the chain was bolted to it. She now had a new, terrible anchor. She was free from the bed, but she was now attached to a heavy, awkward piece of wood. It would slow her down, make a tremendous amount of noise, but it was better than being chained to the house itself. She didn't waste another second. She dragged the slat behind her to the open window. She listened one last time. Silence. She took a deep breath, pushed the wooden slat out the window first. letting it fall with a loud thud onto the grass below. And then, without a moment's hesitation, she scrambled out after it. Her bare feet hit the soft, damp grass of the backyard. For a single, precious second, she was frozen, her body and mind trying to process the overwhelming sensation of freedom. The open sky, the feel of the breeze on her skin, the vastness of the world outside that single room. The thud of the wooden slat had been loud. She had to move. Now, she grabbed the slat and began to run. It was a clumsy, terrifying, and incredibly noisy escape. The heavy piece of wood banged and scraped against the ground behind her, a terrible rhythmic announcement of her flight. She ran towards the back of the yard, her eyes searching for a way out. A 6-foot-high wooden fence surrounded the property. She found the gate, but it was latched from the outside. Panic flared in her chest. She was trapped again. But then she saw it. One of the boards on the fence, near the ground, was loose, warped by years of rain and Sunday. She dropped the slat and threw herself at the fence, prying at the loose board with her bleeding fingers. It splintered, it cracked, and then it broke free, creating a small, jagged opening at the bottom of the fence. It was just big enough. She shoved the wooden slat through the opening first, then squeezed her own body through, scraping her back and sides on the rough, splintered wood. She was out. She was in an alleyway behind the house. She didn't look back. She just ran. The heavy slat, a monstrous bouncing appendage still chained to her ankle. She ran for her life, a desperate, barefoot flight through an unfamiliar suburban neighborhood. The sound of her own ragged breathing and the terrible, scraping sound of her last remaining shackle the only sounds in the world. The escape through the suburban labyrinth was a nightmare of adrenaline and sheer terror. Every house looked the same. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Danielle ran with a desperation she had never known, her lungs burning, her bare feet raw and bleeding from the unforgiving pavement. The wooden slat chained to her ankle was a terrible, clumsy anchor, banging against her leg in the ground, a constant, horrifying reminder of her captivity. She knew she had to find help, but her mind, still reeling from the psychological conditioning, screamed at her that every person she saw could be a member of the organization. A woman watering her lawn, a man getting out of his car, were they friend or foe? She forced the paranoia down. She had to trust someone. She rounded a corner and saw, at the end of the street, the bright, reassuring colors of a convenience store sign. It was a beacon of normalcy, a symbol of a world she was fighting to get back to. She burst through the door of the store, a wild, terrifying apparition. A teenage girl, barefoot and disheveled, with a heavy piece of wood chained to her ankle. The cashier, a young man who had been idly stocking shelves, stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Call 911, Danielle gasped, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. "Please, you have to call the police. Right now." The cashier, snapping out of his stupor, fumbled for the phone behind the counter. The next few minutes were a blur. The sound of sirens, growing closer and closer, the arrival of a police car, its flashing lights a beautiful, terrifying sight. The first officers on the scene found her huddled on the floor behind a display of potato chips, her body shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline finally giving way to a bone-deep, cataclysmic shock. They approached her cautiously, their training kicking in. They saw the chain, the raw fear in her eyes, and they knew this was something far beyond a teenage prank. One of the officers used a bolt cutter from their trunk to free her from the chain and the wooden slat, a final, symbolic act of liberation. She was wrapped in a blanket and gently guided to the back of the patrol car. She was taken directly to the Special Victims Division at police headquarters. When Detective Marcus Jones got the call, a wave of profound, disbelieving relief washed over him. She was alive. She was safe. He met her in a small, quiet interview room. He was prepared to meet a girl who was hysterical, traumatized, and likely unable to provide a coherent narrative. He had arranged for a victim's advocate and a paramedic to be on standby, but the young woman who sat across from him was not who he expected. She was clearly in shock, her body still trembling, but her eyes were a different story. They were clear, focused, and held a spark of incredible, unwavering intelligence. "My name is Danielle Carter," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I was taken this afternoon on my way home from school. The man who took me, His name is Robert Evans." Detective Jones stared at her, stunned into silence. "She had a name. I was in his house," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I can tell you everything about it." And then, for the next 30 minutes, Detective Jones and the other officers in the room listened in a state of absolute reverent awe as Danielle Carter, a 15-year-old girl who had been abducted and chained in a room just hours before, proceeded to give one of the most detailed, precise, and brilliant witness statements they had ever heard. She did not just provide a vague description of her attacker. She provided his full name. She described the scar over his right eyebrow, the Ford logo on his keys, the Timex watch on his wrist. She did not just describe the room she was held in. She provided the names and dosages of his prescription medications. She gave the name of his doctor and the address of the CVS pharmacy where he filled his prescriptions. She described the photograph of him with his mother, the brick house with the white shutters, and the partial street sign that ended in view. She described the pile of mail, the return addresses from his credit card company and the local utility. She gave them a complete, multi-dimensional portrait of her captor's life, a treasure trove of verifiable, actionable intelligence. She had not just escaped a prison, she had memorized it. Detective Jones was no longer just looking at a survivor. He was looking at the single greatest witness he had ever encountered in his entire career. The information Danielle provided was a lightning bolt that electrified the entire investigation. What had been a blind, desperate search just an hour before was now a focused, high-precision manhunt with a clear and definitive target. While Danielle was being tended to by medical staff, Detective Jones and his team sprang into action. They ran the name Robert Evans through their databases, but the name on the prescription bottle was the key. Cross-referencing it with the pharmacy address and the doctor's name, they had a positive identification in under 10 minutes. They pulled up his driver's license photo. It was a perfect match for the description Danielle had given, right down to the small circular scar above his right eyebrow. They had his address, a small, unassuming house in a quiet subdivision less than 5 miles from where Danielle had been abducted. The address was on a street named Clearview Drive. The pieces of the puzzle that Danielle had given them were snapping into place with a stunning, satisfying speed. A dark blue Ford sedan was registered in his name. He had no serious criminal record, just a few minor traffic violations, allowing him to fly completely under the radar. He was a ghost, a perfect anonymous predator, and a 15-year-old girl had just brought him out of the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving light. Detective Jones assembled a SWAT team. There was no time to waste. Evans could return to the house at any moment, discover his victim was gone, and destroy evidence or flee. The takedown had to be fast, precise, and overwhelming. As the heavily armed team rolled out in unmarked vans, other detectives were already working on a search warrant, using the incredible, specific details from Danielle's testimony as probable cause. They arrived at the house on Clearview Drive less than 2 hours after Danielle had escaped. It was exactly as she had implicitly described it through the details she'd gathered. A neat, single-story brick home with white shutters, the very picture of suburban normalcy. The SWAT team moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency surrounding the house. There was no sign of Evans. His car was not in the driveway. They made a dynamic entry, smashing through the front door. The house was empty. They moved immediately to the master bedroom at the back of the house. And there, it all was. The scene was a perfect, chilling confirmation of Danielle's entire story. The queen-sized bed with the cherry wood headboard, the heavy iron frame, and bolted to the frame, the damning, undeniable evidence. A length of steel chain, with an open cuff on the end. On the floor they found the other half of the cuff, the one the first responders had cut from her ankle. The room was a treasure trove of corroborating evidence. The photograph of Evans and his mother was on the dresser. The prescription bottles for Zoloft were on the nightstand. The name Dr. A. Friedman clearly visible. The pile of mail was on the desk. Everything was exactly as their star witness had described it. The search of the house continued, and what they began to find was even more horrifying. In a locked closet in the spare bedroom, they found a collection of trophies. They were personal items. A girl's silver bracelet, a driver's license belonging to a young woman who had been reported missing 2 years prior, a single earring that matched the description of one worn by a victim, in an unsolved assault case. Danielle Carter had not just saved herself. She had, with her incredible mind, given them the key to unlocking a series of cold cases that had haunted the Houston Police Department for years. Robert Evans was not just a kidnapper, he was a serial predator. The trap was set. Detectives in unmarked cars waited patiently. A little after 9 p.m., a dark blue Ford sedan turned onto Clearview Drive and pulled into the driveway. Robert Evans, carrying a bag of fast food, got out of his car. He walked to his front door, likely anticipating the terrified, compliant victim he had left behind. The moment he stepped inside his house, the lights and sirens erupted, and the SWAT team descended. He was arrested without a fight, his face a mask of pure, shocked disbelief. His perfect, controlled world had been shattered. The girl he had so dangerously underestimated had brought his entire secret life crashing down around him. The hours immediately following the arrest were a whirlwind of official procedure and profound, personal relief. The capture of Robert Evans was a major victory for the Houston Police Department. But the true story, the one that resonated most deeply with everyone involved, was the incredible resilience and brilliance of Danielle Carter. Her reunion with her mother was a moment of pure, unadulterated emotion that transcended words. When Sharon Carter rushed into the victim's advocacy room at the precinct, she saw her daughter, wrapped in a blanket, looking small and fragile. But as they embraced, a hug that seemed to contain 7 hours of terror and a lifetime of love, Sharon felt the unyielding strength in her daughter's frame. They held each other and cried. Tears of terror, tears of relief, and for Sharon, tears of an overwhelming, fierce pride that was almost painful in its intensity. "You did it, baby," Sharon whispered into her daughter's hair. "You got yourself home." In the days that followed, the full scope of Robert Evans's crimes began to come to light. The evidence Danielle had provided was the key that unlocked everything. The items found in his closet were definitively linked to at least 3 other violent crimes against women in the Houston area, including the case of a young woman who had been missing for 2 years and was presumed dead. Danielle's testimony had not just closed her own case, it had brought a monster to justice and provided long-awaited, if heartbreaking, answers to other grieving families. Danielle became the key to the prosecution's case. Her mind, the weapon she had used to save herself, was now the prosecution's most powerful asset. She worked with Detective Jones and the district attorney, her memory proving to be a flawless, high-fidelity recording of the events. She recalled conversations verbatim, described objects with photographic clarity, and provided a psychological portrait of her captor that was as insightful as it was damning. The media hailed her as a hero, a prodigy, the girl who outsmarted a monster. But Danielle rejected the labels. She had not acted out of a desire for heroism. She had acted out of a primal, fundamental need to survive. What others saw as extraordinary, she saw as a logical application of the skills she had always possessed. Her cool-headedness was not a lack of fear. It was a refusal to let fear be the only thing she felt. The ordeal had changed her, of course. The world no longer felt as safe or as predictable as it once had. There would be a long road of healing ahead, of processing the trauma that lay beneath her calm, composed exterior. But the experience had not broken her. In a strange, profound way, it had reinforced the core of who she was. It had proven the truth of what her mother had always taught her, that the greatest strength, the most powerful weapon, was a sharp, disciplined, and courageous mind. The story for the public would be about the monster and the takedown, but the true story, the one that mattered, was quieter. It was the story of a mother's unwavering faith in her daughter's strength. It was the story of a detective who was wise enough to listen to his witness. And above all, it was the story of a 15-year-old girl who, when faced with unimaginable darkness, did not scream. She observed, she analyzed, she remembered, and she used the truth as her weapon to not only free herself, but to bring a hidden evil into the light. Her escape was not just a victory for justice. It was a testament to the quiet, unshakable power of a brilliant mind.